All right. Thanks, everybody joining us here live and online. I want to especially thank our guest, Professor Megan Osaka, for joining us. This series is made possible, presented by the CSUSB History Department, the History Club, Phi Alpha Theta, Honor Society, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, the Jack Brown College of Business and Public Administration, and the Intellectual Life Fund. Thanks also to the series co-organizer, Alexander Serrano, who's going to be joining us virtually today, and is a current MA student here at CSUSB and is headed over to UC Santa Barbara in their PhD program in East Asian Languages and Cultural Studies. Thanks to Pam Crossan in the History Department for really making everything in the entire series possible. Of course, first and last thanks to Professor Osaka. Dr. Osaka received her MA and PhD from Yale University with distinction, and she received her BA in Ethnic Studies from Brown University. She is currently Assistant Professor of History at UC Riverside, our neighboring institution here, where she specializes in Asian American history, urban history, and public humanities. Sorry for my hiccups here. I'm just welcoming people who are joining in the waiting room as I'm going. Professor Osaka is trained as an interdisciplinary scholar and public historian. Her work seeks to develop new methodologies and frameworks of analysis for understanding the urban past and present. Her current book project, and I'll share a link to this in the chat, is Seattle from the Margins, Exclusion, Erasure, and the Making of a Pacific Coast City. The book is available for pre-order. We were just talking about the publication date was September. It is now August. The book is going to be available in just a few months. So look out for that from the University of Washington Press, and I will add a note on that in the chat for everybody. The book, Seattle from the Margins, reorients the early history of Seattle through the lens of those displaced and erased in the making of the city as a modern metropolis. This, the dissertation on which the project is based won prizes from the AHA, American Historical Association, the Pacific Coast Branch, and the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. Professor Osaka has also worked extensively in the field of public history, including 5 years as an oral historian and archivist for Densho, a community-based organization that documents and shares the stories of Japanese American incarceration through an online archive and other digital platforms. And I know our department has a big public and oral history component, so I think there's going to be lots of interest in that. Again, I'll share a couple links in the chat to Professor Osaka's faculty profile and the University of Washington Press website for her new book. To attendees, please feel free throughout the duration of Professor Osaka's comments or presentation to type in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. And you can also, please feel free to jump in live at the end. In the meantime, obviously, please remain muted until we move into the Q&A and discussion portion. Today's talk is Labor Camps, Hotels, and Slums, Tracing Asian American History Through the Built Environment. And it will introduce some of Dr. Osaka's ongoing research. Please join me in welcoming Professor Megan Osaka.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Can you hear me? Okay, everyone?
Yes.
The sound is working? Okay. Well, it's wonderful to be here today with all of you and to participate in this exciting speaker series on modern China. I'm obviously not a China specialist. I'm an Asian Americanist, and it's really wonderful to see an interest in bridging these two fields and examining the histories of Asian diaspora, of folks, of Asian people outside of Asia, including here in the US. So my own scholarly work focuses on Seattle, as Jeremy explained, and the Pacific Northwest, a region where I'm from. I grew up there. My family has lived there for many generations. And I know you already have two historians of the Pacific Northwest as well in the history department, which is very exciting for me to see. because I don't think there's enough historical work on the region, and in particular histories of race in the Pacific Northwest, which is in part the subject of my forthcoming book, Seattle from the Margins. So the subject for my talk today, labor camps, hotels, and slums, tracing, right, slums, so-called slums, tracing Asian American history through the built environment, addresses a methodological intervention that my book is making to the study of Asian American history and urban history through the case study of Seattle. And I'll talk a little bit more later about what I mean by the built environment. Right now, I want to focus on Seattle and kind of, what can we learn when we turn our attention to Seattle, make Seattle the focus of a study of Asian American history. So Seattle is actually a very important city to Asian American history. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Seattle emerged as a crucial hub of Asian migration. So mostly in the region, it was Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino. We often think about California as being the center of Asian American history during this period. I'm sure, all of you learned about the gold rush, right? The railroads, San Francisco's Chinatown, right? These are all popular topics, right? When we first start learning about Asian American history, but other cities and other regions played an equally important role in the formation of early Asian American communities, and the Pacific Northwest really was one of those regions. And part of the discussion in my field of Asian American history is that there is such a focus on California. And many of us have been working to try to kind of, and for a lot of reasons that focus is there. But in many ways too, the focus on California exclusively has sort of obscured the historical experiences of Asian Americans in other places, right? And so my book is really trying to center Seattle in this conversation about early Asian American history. So Asian migration to Seattle and the broader Pacific Northwest was tied to the development of the regional economy. And this is what we see, in regions right across the American West. Asian migration during this period was really tied to the development of the capitalist economy, right, during the late 19th century. And in the Northwest, the economy revolved around resource extraction and agriculture. Those were the main industries: fishing, salmon canneries, berry picking, hops cultivation, logging and lumber processing, coal mining. So these were industries that required a highly mobile seasonal workforce. So workers who really moved around from place to place and were desired by employers precisely because they were mobile and because they were able to move around. So the workforce was not a permanent one. It wasn't a workforce like you would see in a factory or manufacturing work, right? The workforce was highly mobile. Asian workers became very dominant in these industries in the Pacific Northwest, really during this kind of late 19th, early 20th century period, beginning with Chinese laborers who came in the 1870s and 1880s and worked in agriculture, in salmon canneries and coal mining, followed by Japanese laborers in the 1890s, 1900s, and early 20th century who worked in sawmills and who also opened up many small businesses that catered to this migrant workforce. And finally, Filipino laborers were another large population of Asian workers who started coming in large numbers to the Pacific Northwest in the 1920s and 1930s and worked really in the salmon canneries and also in agriculture. And this is a picture of Japanese lumber workers, kind of early 20th century, which I love. It's such a detailed photograph. You can see even their clothes and the kind of work they were doing. So the Asian American population of the Pacific Northwest during this time was migratory. They worked in seasonal or temporary jobs that took them from place to place, and they moved around the region, constantly in search of work. So again, as I said, this is not necessarily a stable population that's fixed in place. There's a lot of movement happening. And the center of this labor system and this economic system was Seattle. Seattle served as a stopping over place for workers and others as they moved in and out of the city. So often you would find workers who would come to Seattle, stay there for a few weeks, and then move out, right, on a job, in search of a job, right, kind of in a labor camp or a lumber town on the outskirts of the city or throughout the region. People would also come to Seattle, right, during the winter months when the farms and the canneries really slowed their operations. So Seattle had a very seasonal population as well. And it served as this kind of centralized location or gathering place for workers, which again included large numbers of Asian laborers, as well as other, right, groups, Indigenous workers, European workers, Black workers, and white workers, right? So it was a very heterogeneous population of the labor force. So one thing that's really important to know about Seattle, and I don't know if many of you are familiar with Seattle, if you've been there, but if you do go there, one thing that's really striking immediately is that it's a maritime city, right? It's surrounded by water. And this is really important to understanding kind of the development of the economy and also why Asian workers were so numerous, right, in these industries. So Seattle really is, as I said, surrounded by water. Rivers surround Seattle on the eastern side. So this is a map that was made for my book, and it shows the Pacific Northwest. And right here is the northwest sort of part of Washington state, and Seattle is right here in the middle. And you can see actually how close Seattle is to the US-Canada border. So this is the US-Canada border. And an interesting feature of this region is that part of the border actually goes through water. So you see the border, there's actually kind of a maritime border here. So there's a lot of fluidity between the US and Canada at this time. A lot of people crossed to and from, right, these two countries frequently. But you can see, right, from this map how important, right, the maritime environment really was and still is. So the eastern side here is just flanked by rivers, right? These are all rivers. And here on the western sort of side of the city is Puget Sound, which is a really sort of large inlet that flows into the Pacific Ocean. And this entire body of water here, from the Puget Sound through the Strait of Georgia and the Strait of Juan de Fuca here, and all of the rivers, is part of a larger body of water called the Salish Sea. Okay, so the Salish Sea really spans two countries, it spans two regions, and it all connects to the Pacific Ocean. So this maritime environment was really important during this early period because it allowed for the movement of people and goods before the arrival of the railroad. Often, there is an association, a strong association of Asian migration and labor with the railroads, right? I mean, for good reason. Think of, the importance of Chinese railroad workers in building the Transcontinental Railroad. But in the Pacific Northwest, railroads really had less of an impact, right, on labor and on the economy. Seattle didn't have a direct connection to a transcontinental railroad line until the 1890s. So that was 2 to 3 decades after, right, California secured a connection to the railroad. So what we see then is the water playing much more of an important role in the formation of the economy in the Pacific Northwest and also in the movement of workers. So Seattle really did develop, as I said, around maritime routes and around maritime networks. People moved along the water. And as a consequence, Seattle had a much stronger connection to the Asia and the Pacific world than it did even to the rest of the continental United States. So it's really important to understand Seattle during this period as a Pacific-oriented city. And this is a really interesting map. It's a kind of promotional map that was published by city kind of leaders and these sort of boosters, people who wanted to promote the city and promote like economic development in the region, late 19th century. And you can see how they're positioning Seattle within a larger Pacific world and highlighting the proximity, right, of Seattle to these Pacific regions. So there's Australia, China, Singapore, Russia, right? All of these Pacific areas and regions, as well as Victoria is appearing on this map, and San Francisco, right? So it's a very interesting, right, depiction of what the city leaders kind of were envisioning at this time as being a sort of Pacific, very Pacific oriented city. And this can also help us to explain, to help to understand why Asian workers became so dominant in the workforce, and how and why Seattle emerged as a hub, important hub of Asian migration. So Asian workers really were coming by steamship, right? They moved by water across the Pacific. And they also moved around by boat or smaller ferry to access job sites. So salmon canneries that were lining the rivers of the Salish Sea, farms that were situated right along the coastal areas, so they could access this labor force. Many Asian workers also entered North America through Vancouver. And again, going back to this map here, Vancouver is very close to Seattle. If you travel by water, you can see, right? So, and there was many opportunities for people to move to and from both cities. And there was a strong connection between Seattle and Vancouver. So oftentimes you also see Asian workers coming to Canada, landing in Vancouver, and then moving into Seattle by boat. So what we have during this period then is a Pacific-oriented economy and geography that created linkages and routes of migration that spanned the Pacific Ocean, and also regionally within the Pacific Northwest that spanned the Salish Sea. For the historian, though, tracing this history is very difficult. And you know, for me, it's challenging, right? So how does a historian trace the history of a group of people who are constantly on the move, who are mobile, and not necessarily fixed in place all the time? That was the central kind of, you know, question or sort of problem that I was trying to solve with this project, with this book. And yet I felt it was really necessary to do so in order to fully understand the experience of Asian migration and labor during this period, and really to understand early Asian American communities. And this is where actually the built environment plays an important role, where it really figures centrally in my work. So if you think about the archives that we turn to as historians, and I know some of you are historians in this group, it's often through records that document stable communities who are rooted in place. So we look at things like tax records, leases, property deeds, marriage certificates, payroll reports, city directories. And these sources are all very important sources, right? But they do often privilege people who are permanent, who are right, these kind of formation of these stable communities, and sort of permanent institutions. What these sources aren't so good at showing us is the itinerant workforce and their experiences, right? The seasonal workers, the migrant workers, people who are living in Seattle maybe half the year and then moving out of the city, people who have a connection to the city but don't necessarily live there full time, people who work maybe in a lumber camp for 3 months out of the month, and then spend 1 month in Seattle and then move back, right? So people, again, who are tied to the city, but don't necessarily live there in permanent communities. And this was particularly true for Asian laborers, who were very, as I said, very dominant in the seasonal and mobile workforce, and were also restricted in many ways from owning property, from becoming citizens. They were subjected to employment discrimination, excluded from mainstream unions, and were also marginalized politically, right? So we're talking about a group of people who were not only moving around from place to place, but also were marginalized, right, at the time in terms of economically, socially, politically. So my work looks at the built environment as what I call an archive that contains valuable historical information about the lives and labors of Seattle's migratory workforce that is not available through other sources. So a little bit about what do I mean by the built environment, right? Well, the built environment is really the kind of man-made physical world that surrounds us, from buildings and streets to homes and warehouses, the collection of physical sites and spaces that we interact with every day and that really kind of make up, right, our world. My interest really is in the built environment of the past. So looking at the historical sites that served this migratory workforce, the physical sites of work, residence, and leisure, and some of them are depicted here in this slide. And these sites can serve as a kind of archive that we can analyze in a way that yields information about the lives and social worlds of the people who inhabited them. So I look at, in my book, right, the kind of main sites I look at are hotels, bunkhouses, labor camps, lumber towns, and these so-called slum districts to illuminate the history of this migratory workforce. And here are some sites on this slide that I think are really interesting. On the left is a Chinese agricultural encampment. And you can see there's it's written on the top, Chinese hop pickers. This was the earliest photo that I was able to find actually of Chinese agricultural workers in the Pacific Northwest. And you can see just from this slide here, right, there's the encampment in sort of in tents, right? And it gives you a really good sense right away of the kind of living conditions there, working conditions. On the right here, and this is actually a family photograph from my great-grandfather's photo album, family photo album. This is a group of lumber workers, Japanese lumber workers, who are sitting kind of outside of a bunkhouse. And some of them, it's hard to see here, but you can see they're sort of smoking a pipe and they're taking a break, right, from their work. And this photo cut off here, but there's a lot of detail in the, you can see in the window a little bit. And you can see like a homemade curtain and a table. And then up here is what's called a Hooverville. It was a shanty town that sprouted up in Seattle, and there were many others like this around the country. That sprouted up sort of during and after the Great Depression, when there was a lot of economic devastation. People lost their jobs and their homes. And so this was a kind of informal sort of shanty town that sprouted up in Seattle. And it's right near the waterfront here. You can see a ship. It's right by the port. So the built environment is really an interesting kind of repository of information. It's really guest book of a hotel, that we can see the identities of workers who passed through Seattle over time, while floor plans, photographs, and building descriptions reveal living and working conditions. And the built environment is particularly valuable, I argue, for understanding this period in Asian American history. Again, because Asian laborers were highly concentrated in these jobs, and were also marginalized, right? And so don't often appear in the traditional archival records that we often look to as historians. So I wanted to turn, just checking for the time here. Okay. I wanted to turn to kind of one case study, right, to sort of illustrate what I mean, right? What does it mean to sort of analyze the built environment, or to use the built environment as an archive? So one of the sites that I use a lot in my book, and that was really important in developing the project and my research, is the hotel. So let me just show you. Okay, actually, this is another family photograph. So hotels were very important forms of housing in the late 19th and early 20th century period. And they functioned a bit differently from the hotels, I guess, we think of today, that cater more to tourists, to business people, and they're a bit more on the expensive side, right? Like the West End, things like that. Hotels from this period really provided accommodations for workers, for migrants, for people who didn't have a lot of money, who maybe resided in the city temporarily or were restricted from other neighborhoods and other forms of housing, right? And so the definition of a hotel, there wasn't really a set definition at the time, and so you see a lot of different kind of building structures, right, that were considered hotels. This was a very common one, very sort of small, right? So 2 stories. And you can see the ground floor has a lobby area here, and then a couple of businesses, right? So you can see a barber shop, a tailor shop on the ground floor. And then the top floor here are sleeping rooms, right, for people to sleep in. And this is a very common, again, type of hotel. And hotels were actually the most dominant building type in cities along the Pacific coast. So not just Seattle, but also LA and San Francisco. And these three cities, Seattle, LA, and San Francisco, had actually the highest concentration of hotel rooms per capita in the entire country in the 1920s. So again, these hotels played a really important role in housing, in providing housing for people. And hotels were quite attractive, right, to laborers and others who didn't have a lot of money. They didn't require a lease agreement. There was no security deposit, and people could rent the rooms by the night, by the week, or the month. And they were often located in dense urban environments near transportation, and with many different businesses clustered nearby. So you can just see from this slide here, right, that this is a pretty dense, city block. There's, I believe this is I think there's a boot here. So that must mean it's like a blacksmith shop, cobbler, right? There's again, as I said, a barber shop, a tailor shop, right? There's a grocery store. So these hotels were often located in very dense urban environments, neighborhoods, and streets that often catered to, right, people on the move, and so often had other kinds of businesses like cafes, restaurants, bathhouses, right, barber shops as well. They were part of a broader urban network that catered to people on the move. In Seattle, Japanese immigrants actually operated the majority of these kinds of hotels. So, which is a really interesting feature, right, of Seattle, that Japanese hotel operators were really very dominant in the hotel business. And this really has an interesting history. It was tied to their role as laborers and in the employment business. So many hotels in the late 19th century were operated by Japanese, what we call labor contractors. So labor contractors were, labor contracting was a common employment system in the late 19th century. And it was really present throughout the American West, but was particularly common among Chinese and Japanese immigrant, right, populations and communities. So a labor contractor was someone who, usually a prominent individual, right, from a particular community who had risen to a position of prominence, often had connections with other sort of prominent people in their home countries and also in the cities where they were located. And what they would do was they would recruit workers from their home countries and also from around the regions, transport them, whether across the Pacific or they would transport them, from Vancouver, wherever they were. They would find them jobs and would also manage the employment of these workers. So they were very useful to big industrial firms like railroad companies, sawmills, canneries, right? Big agribusiness, people who wanted, they offered in some ways the flexibility of hiring a temporary workforce. So the employer, what they would do is they would go to Seattle, and Seattle again was the center of employment services, of labor contracting. They would go to, for example, Huachong. Huachong was a Chinese labor contractor, one of the most prominent in all of North America. And they would say, I need 60 Chinese workers, right, to work on the harvest, right, in 2 weeks. And they would pay them a lump sum of money. And then the contractor would recruit the workers, right, manage the workers, pay the workers. So it could be, as you could imagine, an exploitative business, right? Because the workers who were working for the contractors were often marginalized, right? Were newcomers, right, to the country and didn't have a lot of connections. They didn't have a lot of, they had really few rights. So it could be a very exploitative business. And this is a advertisement for Huachong, who was, as I said, a very, very prominent Chinese labor contracting business. And this is really interesting, as you'll note here from the advertisement, they're offering not only Chinese labor, but also Chinese goods. So oftentimes labor contractors operated import-export businesses and would sell things like Chinese paintings, right, food, things like that, as well as offering, right, employment services. So you can see here, others requiring Chinese help, or Chinese labor, will be furnished on short notice. And here is a Japanese labor contractor called, this was the Furuya company. And Furuya was also quite prominent and really had branches, as you can see in his business card here, in Tacoma and Portland, Vancouver, Yokohama, and Kobe. So this is a trans-Pacific kind of labor network, system of recruitment and employment. And Seattle was the hub for this. So where do hotels come in? Well, a lot of labor contractors like Furuya here operated hotels as part of their business. So what they would do was they would have their employment services or their office on the first floor. And then the top floors would be reserved for housing for the workers. And so it was part of their kind of their sort of business model. So they would house the workers in their hotels, so they would be more accessible and ready to go when they received a kind of, contract with a company. And so the early hotels, and this is from the kind of early, late 19th, early 20th century, were operated by Japanese labor contractors and almost exclusively housed Japanese laborers. So it was connected to this employment business, but this started to change. So one thing that affected this was anti-Japanese hostility and began to arise, right? And the same story happened with the Chinese several decades previously. And the US government started to pass immigration restrictions. So I'm sure you're familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, which restricted the immigration of Chinese laborers into the US. Japanese laborers were targeted with a kind of a similar type of restriction, which was the Gentleman's Agreement of 1907 to 1908. And that was a series of diplomatic negotiations between the US and Japan which kind of, in essence, mirrored the Chinese Exclusion Act in that it restricted Japanese labor migration. So it made it impossible for Japanese laborers to enter the US. So as you can imagine, these immigration restrictions really put an end to the trans-Pacific movement of workers and to the trans-Pacific labor contracting business. And so many of these labor contractors and others started to pursue other businesses. And one of those businesses that they began to pursue was hotel operation, right? And so they began to expand beyond just their kind of employment business of Japanese workers, and they began to open hotels that catered to a broader sort of range of workers, right? Again, because these hotels were very important, right, to these cities. Japanese immigrants began to sort of enter into this business in really, really large numbers. Let me just show you this slide. So by the 1920s, Japanese immigrants operated 1/4 of all the hotels in Seattle, which was quite amazing given the fact that they only accounted for 1% of the city's population in the 1920s. So you can see kind of here, this is on the right is a slide, a map from my book. And on the top is the little squares here are depicting hotels. And so in 1910, you can see how they're really clustered, right, in one area. And this area here was kind of like a workers' hub. So it's near the train station, it was near the port, and it was a very well-known workers' hub and center of employment services. But by 1920, you can see that Japanese hotels had really spread from just this kind of area here, really throughout the city. And they're concentrated in particular along the waterfront. And these hotels catered to a lot of longshoremen, dock workers, people working on ships, right? So you can see really how much they moved into this business, and they really spread throughout the city. Here's an interesting ad for the NP Hotel, which still stands in Seattle today, the Hotel NP, the Northern Pacific Hotel, operated by a Japanese immigrant family. And this was actually an ad from that in Japanese, right? So they were advertising the hotel to Japanese speaking people. And this is, I just really like this photograph in the center here. This is the kind of, family that would run a hotel, and often they were family businesses. Okay. So the hotel is really interesting for me as an Asian Americanist and someone interested in this early period in Asian American history, this business was dominated by Japanese immigrants and was also very important to the regional economy. So without hotels, the kind of economic system that developed in Seattle around flexible, mobile labor wouldn't have been possible. And so I was fascinated with hotels, through my research as a social space and also for their economic function in the urban and regional economy. And so I wanted to show you just a couple of sources, right, that I used to give you a sense of how I sort of delved into understanding, right, the kind of world of the hotels. So this is, does anyone know what this is? Any architects or people who want to be architects? This is a floor plan, right? Actually, this floor plan comes from the NP Hotel shown here, right? So I was able to track down the floor plan of the NP, the original design, right, of the building that was housed in the city archives. And so here, right, so this is a really interesting source, okay, because, well, it's the plan of one floor of the NP Hotel. And right away, you can see that this is a pretty sort of well-designed, right, building, in that the rooms are all kind of the same size. And you can see here that these are sinks, this is a closet, and that there are bathrooms on either end of the hallway. So often these hotels had communal bathrooms. Some of them had plumbing, some of them actually did not. This one has indoor plumbing, you can see, because there's a bath and there's toilets in the hotel. There's a corridor. And also another thing you can see from this plan is that there are windows, right? So, and I have another plan I'll show you that really contrasts significantly with this, but each room actually has a window, and you can see the window here. And that was actually really significant because not all of these places had windows for every room. So what you can see from this, right, from this plan is you can see the rooms, you can see that they had a sink in there, you can see that there were communal bathrooms, right? So it gives you a kind of sense of how, what the interior of a hotel looked like, at least right, according to how it was designed. Okay, so let's look. So this is an actual architectural sort of drawing of the NP Hotel. And it was actually a very standard type of floor plan. A lot of hotels that were constructed in the early 20th century kind of followed this. It was an I-shape plan. Let me show you a different one. So here's another one. And this was actually reconstructed after the fact. It was not an architectural plan filed with the city, but it was reconstructed a little bit later on. But this provides an interesting contrast. So this is a different type of hotel. You can tell right away because, right, look at the rooms. They're very concentrated. There's a lot of really small rooms. Not all of them have access to a window. And in fact, very few of them do. So you can see the windows are here, right? And these are basically like little cubicles. There were sort of informal cubicles that separated people into different spaces. And often it was very bare bones in this kind of hotel. There would be just a cot. And this hotel was called, what at the time, a dime bed. So people would pay a dime for a cot, just a simple cot in a kind of cubicle-like space in the floor of a hotel. And you can see here too that there's only one bathroom, right? Instead of two, like the other hotel, there was only one bathroom. And it's not clear to me what was in the bathroom, but most likely it was just sort of toilets. There was probably not a shower or bathtub. So again, just with these two floor plans, so looking at this one and this one, you can already tell a few things, right? You can tell that there was a range, right, of accommodations available to people. This one was probably accommodating people who were living in the city more long-term, right, who maybe rented a room by the month. This one was much more catering to people who were maybe sleeping there for a night, moving in and out. and much more affordable. So this was a dime bed. It was called 10 cents a night. This would have been probably 50 cents a night, right? So it required a little bit more in terms of what you paid. So these are two examples, right, of the kinds of sources that I used to begin to imagine and to understand what it was like, right, to live in these hotels and to understand the kind of interior environments. What do they look like, right, on the inside? And then I supplement these floor plans when possible with this source. This is a really interesting source. Does this look familiar to anyone? If you've done any kind of US history research, this is probably a familiar source. This is the census. It's the 1910 census. And so this can give us a sense of what the census is. A bit of a tricky source. It's really a snapshot in time. It gives us, right, a snapshot. And it is, as you can see, very dependent on what the census enumerator at the time is seeing and recording. And so it records in many ways a lot of their biases, but it does really, so this is I should say, back up a little bit. This is the census page from the 1910 census Seattle, from a Japanese operated hotel in the kind of southern district of the city, right? That southern area, that kind of workers area by the port and the train station. And so already you can see, right, that it's a multiracial space, right? That there are Japanese, that there are Black residents living there. It's also mixed gender, right? There are men and women. So these are already really interesting pieces of information about who's living in the hotel. But not only that, you can also really see the biases of the census enumerator, right? So look, the people listed aren't even given names. They're just it says a person, right? A person. And then what's so interesting, caught my attention about this particular page of the census, was the little note that the census enumerator writes at the bottom of the page, and as a kind of like comment on what they're seeing. And it's really hard to read. But what they say is, okay, the note is, there are about 100 persons here, both male and female, whites, Blacks, Japs, occupying rooms in this hotel, and all engaged in various questionable businesses, right? So right away you're seeing, not only from this census record, a kind of sense of who's living in this particular hotel, but also the anxieties, right, that are being provoked by these kinds of living arrangements, by the social worlds, right, among people in power, right? They're sort of right, this is not a neutral description of the people living here, right? Because the census enumerator says already they're engaged in questionable businesses, right? So, and right, the census enumerator here is making a kind of moral judgment about the inhabitants based on their living in a hotel, their social configurations, right? That they're living in multiracial spaces, that they're living in mixed gender spaces, and they're not living, right, within these kind of white nuclear family sort of structures, right? And kind of within the single family home, when you have these kinds of normative gender arrangements, right? This is a very heterogeneous world inside these hotels. And so we can see not only that, but also the kind of sort of anxieties that this is provoking among people in power. And finally, just to kind of add on another source, which I used to sort of fill out the picture of the hotel industry and the hotel business, and the kinds of not only who was living there and the social worlds contained within, but also, how people in power were viewing these spaces. This is a map of one city block in, actually, this was in Japantown. And what you can see immediately, right, by the map maker, and this was it's called a Sanborn fire insurance map. And these are very useful and interesting sources to use for historical research. So this was taken, I believe, in the early 20th century. And you can see already how they are designating the kind of hotels, right, on the map. They're not just hotels, right? They're derisively referred to as Jap lodgings, right? And you can see this here. You can see this here. And so already you can see from this map, not only really the interesting physical arrangement of the businesses and hotels here on these city blocks, right? You can see how dense they were. So that's really useful information. But we can also gain and glean a sense of what, right, the map maker is believing about this, right? That they're pointing out that this is a Japanese hotel. And they're creating a kind of racial narrative here in the map. So again, as I said, these sources, right, the floor plans, the census, the maps, even photographs, right, are really useful and have been useful for me on two levels. They give us a glimpse of what life was like in the hotels, the living conditions, the kinds of people who inhabited them, the social worlds formed within the interiors, but they can also tell us something else, how these hotels were viewed by people in power and how they were often targeted, right, with policing. So the built environment is not only about the physical space, right, the building itself, but also about the cultural meanings and moral judgments ascribed to these spaces over time. How meaning became accrued, right? In particular, housing arrangements, building types, city blocks, and neighborhoods, and meanings, right, from two different levels, from the people who lived inside and gave it meaning, and also from people, right, in positions of power looking down. So really these sources can give you a sort of bottom up and a top down kind of understanding, right, of the city in this moment. And so just to kind of conclude, I have no idea where I'm at with the time. I'm sorry, I kind of lost track of time. I could go on and on, so I'll just wrap up now. But the built environment has been really valuable in my work. It contains information about the past that's not really available through other sources. And this is particularly important for reconstructing the histories of marginalized peoples who were marginalized at the time, right? Politically, economically, socially, and don't often appear in these kind of traditional archival sources. But beyond, I think, the value, the scholarly value, right, as historians, it also speaks to what I think is the importance of preserving these sites today in the present, right? Part of what my book does is traces the process of demolition and the destruction of these spaces over time. And many of them were demolished in the 1930s and the 1940s and viewed by the city as these kinds of roadblocks, right, to urban progress. And so very few of the actual sites that I study in the book are still standing, right? The NP Hotel that I showed in the earlier slide is really an anomaly in that sense. As I said, many of them were actually physically demolished and erased from the landscape. And with that demolition becomes an erasure of the people who inhabited the spaces, and also an erasure of their historical presence and contributions, right, to building the city. And so I want to end by really making an argument for the value of the built environment and the value of these landscapes to our understanding of Asian American history. And in particular, the history of Asian laborers within Seattle and within other cities as well. So I'll just stop there. Let me stop.
Thank you, Megan. That was perfect. No, that was perfect in terms of timing. We have as much time as we need to discuss now. Lots of questions came up for me. I'm really interested in asking a few questions, but before I do, I also want to open the floor to all of our attendees. You can either type questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and hop in virtually. We've got a nice gathering here, so I'll leave time for that. Anybody who wants to jump in, please do so. As I'm waiting, I'll ask a quick, sort of a big question, and that is on uniqueness versus representation, and that's a big one for me in my work, and I know almost everybody, I think, but I've been teaching MA students here for the last 2 years. We've got a new program, and when they sort of drill down on case studies, that's a big question that comes up again and again. And so I'd like to just ask you a little bit about how you grapple with that. I often think about it a lot in my own work. How do you navigate that question of when this is a unique, localized study, as you showed, even at the family level, personal level, and then when you zoom out and say this is representative, and that So I guess any way you'd like to address that that dilemma, whether it's when you're heading toward publication or when you're teaching, anything that you'd like to talk about on that subject.
Yeah, thanks for, I mean, I really struggled with that too. I mean, it was hard for me too, because partly it's that Seattle is not a very well-known city, and it's not well covered in the scholarship in urban history, especially in this time period. So a lot of it was like, I mean, an advisor of mine was like, well, if you're writing about Chicago or New York, you wouldn't really have to make, you wouldn't really have, people would understand why it was important. So a lot of the work that I was doing leading up to the book was trying to understand actually that very question. And for me, what I think about this is that Seattle, I think, is significant and unique in its own way, right? I think the way that the sort of maritime geography is, the sort of actual landscape itself, the topography, that makes it necessary to kind of develop new frameworks of analysis and new sort of methodologies, right, for understanding the history. And yet at the same time, we can use those to sort of turn our lens onto other cities, right? So we can use what I'm doing by tracing the history of Seattle through the built environment and like looking at the kind of migratory workforce is necessary in Seattle, but it's also, you can use it in a way that can be applied, I think, to other cities of this time, right? And so I think that what Seattle shows us is how to tell the history of a city from the perspective of the migratory, the mobile population, because there was just such a high degree of workers, of itinerant workers. And yet so many cities in this time period, especially in the American West, were also, right, developing around the same kinds of workers. And so it's kind of, so the answer is sort of, I'm doing both, right? I'm saying Seattle is really interesting for these reasons. It's really unique for these reasons. How can we think about the city differently? How can we develop new frameworks? How can we develop new methodologies? And in turn, right, use those to better understand, right, this population in other cities as well. That's kind of how I came down to it, right, in my book.
Thanks. That's really helpful. It's a constant, it's such a constant kind of negotiation.
Definitely.
In my work on Hainan Island in China, that's always sort of at the center. Like a lot of people say, who cares about this place? So you got to always make the case. Mark has his hand raised, and then after that, we've got a question from Mary in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. Hello again, Megan. I appreciate your presentation. We are both from Seattle, so as you know, hometown kids, of course, it's important to us, and we believe that the history should be taught and everybody should know it. So, so I feel you on that. I have two questions. If you wouldn't mind kind of commenting on the issue of segregation in the city. You know, I'm guessing that a lot of your work kind of concentrates on International District, Chinatown, Japantown, kind of that area of the city. And so if you would maybe just kind of talk more about kind of what your research found in terms of like why that area, or kind of maybe surprising, you know, exceptions to those kinds of segregations, or other kind of thoughts. You know, and then the kind of second question is, it sounds like the kind of turn of the century kind of urban density with businesses and kind of housing is kind of like what cities like Seattle are trying to reproduce now, you know, with kind of trying to create more sustainable kind of housing and kind of reducing traffic on freeways and long commutes, you know, kind of having these more kind of livable urban spaces. I wonder if you have any thoughts about kind of how your research comments on our own kind of modern day struggle around housing, you know, access and so forth. So yeah, anything about kind of that urban density issues you would like to comment on, I'd appreciate as well.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Yes, segregation is a huge part of my book. I kind of didn't talk about it as much, just to focus on the methodological sort of, you know, tracing the methodology. But segregation, my book sort of offers a history of segregation before redlining, right? So it's how did the city, the forms and modes of segregation that existed and that were implemented even when the city was created in the 1850s. And so I kind of mentioned, right, this north-south distinction. And in Seattle, if you're from Seattle, you really know, right, that there's a kind of north and south, right, kind of racial geography. And so my work really traces the emergence of that geography. And why Asian laborers, for example, were concentrated in the southern part of the city. And it had to do with, and what I talk about in the early chapters of the book, is the segregation of the Duwamish and other indigenous peoples to that area because they were needed as a workforce. They were sort of removed from the city and concentrated to the southern part so they could be accessed as laborers. And then when the Chinese started arriving, that's where they were also segregated. So, and then when other sort of Asian workers and other populations started arriving, they were segregated in this area as well. And so that's kind of the history of segregation that I'm tracing. But you probably noticed that on the map, of the hotels, that the Japanese were actually operating hotels well beyond that segregated space. And the Japanese actually were an exception, in some ways they found they were able to pursue a lot of spatial mobility in the city through their hotel business. But what I also talk about is that anytime, Asians moved into the northern area, which was kind of the white area, they were targeted with restrictions. They were targeted, heavily policed. So the hotel spaces above, in that kind of northern area along the waterfront, were heavily policed by the city, by the fire department, by the building department, the health department. So that's the kind of story that I tell, is a story of a city divided along north-south lines, white, non-white, but also the exceptions to that in certain moments, and what the people who were those exceptions faced a lot of harassment by the police. The second part of your, housing density. Yes. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is the hotel, because they became known later as SROs, or single room occupancy hotels, were actually a really important source of housing for people in cities, beyond World War II. So we see actually the story, the hotels were one of the buildings, built environments that sort of lasted beyond World War II. And SROs were really important in San Francisco, LA, Seattle for housing people, elderly folks, low-income folks. And a lot of them were demolished during the era of so-called urban renewal in the 70s. There's an excellent documentary about this, The Fall of the I Hotel, that was made in the 1980s about the demolition of the I Hotel in San Francisco that housed a lot of elderly Filipino workers. And so these were demolished. And I think, so one of the things that I think was lost, with this form of housing was affordable housing, in the city that was close to transportation. And that all the reasons that I described earlier in terms of, the attraction of these hotels for people, they didn't require a security deposit. They didn't require a lease, They were often much more affordable. And they also kind of were community centers, They had a lot of communal facilities, kitchens, But what we're seeing actually is the refurbishment of some of these SROs, the Publix Hotel. I don't know if you're familiar with that case study, but it was an SRO back in the 1920s and 30s that has now been kind of refurbished into very luxury, housing apartments today, catering to, Amazon workers, kind of tech workers. And so unfortunately, what I think is happening is that there is a desire to, around housing density, as you said. But what what I'm seeing is that this density is catering towards, tech workers, and people who are making a lot of money, and they're not affordable anymore, So that's, and that's kind of what I've been seeing, and the SROs weren't perfect, but I think they were such a vital source of housing, and it's one thing, I think, among many that was really a big loss during this period, the 60s and 70s, was the loss of these spaces. So, yeah.
Thanks, Megan. And thanks, Mark, for joining and for that question. We've got a couple questions in the chat, and thanks to Mary Texera for bringing your great students to the conversation as well. Question from Mary is, you touched on this a little bit, Megan, but please talk in a little more detail about the significance the series of anti-Chinese immigrant acts, and I'd add on to that a little bit the difference when there's such a large Japanese population in this period, and then that's actually going to lead a little bit into Megan Kairos' question in just a second. But please.
Yeah. So what we find with the immigration restrictions. So starting with well, actually the Page Act, right, which was one of the first federal exclusion acts, which targeted prohibited the entry of Chinese women into the U.S. 1875. The Chinese Exclusion Act. Then you have the Gentleman's Agreement, right? And so on, right? There's exclusion laws that are passed that become ever more restrictive on the federal level. But how that affected this particular history is that as the immigration laws were passed, like the Chinese exclusion, that cut off, right, a source of labor for these industries. And so what they did was they searched for other sources of labor. So that's why you kind of see, my book traces I talked about right in the beginning of the talk, Chinese workers were very dominant, then Japanese kind of come in and replace them, then Filipinos come in, right? And that is because of the immigration restrictions, right, that were in place that cut off, right, the source of labor from China. And then so employers were searching, where can we find more labor? Okay, Japan. And then Japanese workers come, and then they're targeted with restrictions. And then employers kind of look around, right, and they're, okay, Filipino workers, right? And so it's this kind of successive waves of immigration are very much map onto successive immigration restrictions. Is what I found. So yeah. And in Seattle too, there was, as I talk about in my book, not only immigration laws, but also kind of violent movements against Asian people, right? So there was a very sort of infamous anti-Chinese mob, right, attack in Seattle and also Tacoma, where all the Chinese were driven out of the city for the most part, right? And so it was also, there was also violence, right, in these periods that accompanied the immigration restrictions. And then Jeremy, you asked about the Japanese. So one thing I didn't get into, I mean, there's so many layers to the story, and my book really delves a lot into the nuances among these different Asian groups, right? So there's a lot of differences between Chinese, Japanese, and Filipinos at this time. I think they're lumped together as one now as Asian Americans. But in the pre-war period, they didn't think of themselves that way. And there was a lot of divisions between these different groups. And one of the things that I've seen was that Japanese immigrants in particular were able to access a degree of power within the city. And this kind of goes against what we often think about, right, with early Asian American history, but Japanese immigrants were able to open businesses. They were able to, again, they attained this kind of degree of power within the city. And some of that had to do with the role of Japan. Japan was a powerful, right, global, it was a global power at this time, and in some ways a rival to the United States. And so the Gentleman's Agreement was one case where you see differences between Chinese exclusion and what was happening with the Japanese, because the Gentleman's Agreement allowed for the entry of Japanese women. That was something that Japan negotiated with the US and felt it was very important for the overseas Japanese communities to have wives and to have families, right? And to not just be a male laboring population. So that's why actually Japanese were able to open so many businesses, is because they had families. And families, right, if you think about a family, it's easier to run a business when you have kids, right? When you have, two parents. These were family businesses that were much easier to run as a family, right? Meant you didn't have to hire outside help. And so, and I would argue actually the Japanese were in some ways more threatening because they had managed to attain a degree of economic and spatial mobility within the city. And that ties a little bit into their incarceration, right? That I think that they were a little bit of a threat to the city in a way, because they were able to, again, access a degree of power and mobility within the city and this was true, not just in Seattle, but I think this was true up and down the West Coast. Yeah.
Thanks, Megan. That was great. And just as before we move on to Megan Karas's question, which is going to jump us into the 40s, and I know this is something that you wasn't part of your talk, but it's something that has been a big part of your work. While we're on that subject that you were just talking about, the series co-organizer Alexander Serrano, who is home today, I'd like to ask a quick follow-up in his stead, because he's working on the role or the importance of the Chinese queue, the Qing Dynasty queue hairstyle. And was there any movement between these populations in this period that you are seeing in terms of a kind of racial passing that might have happened when there was escalations in violence towards one group or another group, obviously exclusion of the Chinese groups. Alexander's finding that the Q, which is the shaven forelock and the long pigtail, of course, the Manchu Qing dynasty, is a very easy sort of race marker in this period. Are you seeing, when there's such a significant Japanese population, that there is any fluidity there in terms of Chinese migrants choosing to cut the queue and grow the forelock in as a way of perhaps moving themselves out of that excluded group of Chinese into the broader East Asian population? Or is that something that, for example, names and other paperwork is going to prevent? This is sort of a big question, but I was wondering.
Yeah, I haven't come across any examples of that. I do know that the Q, there was, not in Seattle, but I know in California, there was these sort of anti-Q, right, ordinances in places like San Francisco, and that was fought, right, in court by Chinese immigrants. But passing Chinese who tried to, you know what, I haven't come across anything like that. I do know that during World War, after Pearl Harbor, many Asians, right, Chinese and Filipinos, wore buttons, right, saying, I am not Japanese, right? So don't associate me with Japanese because we don't want to be targeted. That was a huge thing, right? I can't say that I've come across any of that. I do know, though, that there was a lot of tension between Japanese and Chinese, right, communities. There was a lot of tension there. Especially right around the 30s, right? And that oftentimes Japanese leaders would look to the Chinese experience in the US and say, we don't want to be like that. Like basically blaming, right, the Chinese for, often Japanese leaders were saying, oh, they're not quote unquote assimilating enough. And that's why they were being targeted. So we have to do what we can, right, to kind of Westernize, to Americanize, to appear like we, are Christian, or we speak English, we're upstanding citizens. So that was a very dominant kind of discourse within the Japanese kind of immigrant leadership, which we see also with other communities as well, right? But, it didn't really, it's like they would emphasize that, and yet it didn't really matter, right? It didn't get them very far in terms of how, it wasn't effective in terms of form of resistance. But that was a kind of dominant response. But I can't think of any sort of passing, like Chinese sort of trying to pass as Japanese to sort of deflect, right, racial hostility. I haven't found that in my research. It's an interesting question, though.
Yeah, I mean, the question of passing or community solidarity, and it's a really interesting thing because I've seen it more in communities where there isn't as significant another East Asian population. So, but that's really helpful, actually, that explanation of the rigidity and the hostility between these, or the potential hostility, the sort of tension between these groups. We have two more questions in the chat. Megan jumps us into the 40s within this workforce in Seattle. How were they, the people in the city, affected by Japanese internment?
Yeah. So one thing that I didn't touch on, but that is important to note, is that by the 30s, the kind of resource-based economy was really in decline. So that's part of the story, is that the city, and this is true right up and down the West Coast, was transitioning away from resource extraction, agriculture, and towards manufacturing. So manufacturing became the dominant sort of economic system in Seattle beginning, well, it started actually during World War I, but really accelerated in the late 1930s. And so there was a decline in the kinds of jobs, right, that were sort of in demand for this migratory workforce. And so we do see that as a consequence, the Japanese actually lose a little bit of clout sort of in the city, because so much of what they were doing was tied to this kind of this migratory workforce and serving them, right? And being these kind of middlemen, right? Who ran the barbershops and the hotels and the small businesses that catered to these groups. So that's kind of one thing, right? Is that by the Pearl Harbor, that this economic system was kind of in decline. Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a lot of effects in Seattle because of the incarceration. I mean, because the Japanese were such a big population and they were very important to the city. What we see is, for example, there's like a housing crisis, right? Because the Japanese were operating so many of these hotels, and hotels housed so many people that was an immediate impact, right? It was kind of like there was a housing crisis. They couldn't find enough people to run these hotels. That was one. Yeah, and there were many others, right? Like, it's just, to me, also, it's like, I still don't feel like Seattle has really, grappled with the fact that so many people who were living in the city and that were, people's neighbors were just expelled, right? Expelled, every single person. And that to me is the thing that, I don't know, it sort of haunts me a little bit. Like, how can a city expel, its Japanese American population? I mean, we're talking, there was over 10,000 people, and yet, kind of hold itself up as this sort of racially progressive city. That's the kind of tension also. My book sort of, it's not the main topic of it, but that's sort of the undercurrent. But yeah, so sorry, that was a little bit of a rambling answer, but yeah, there was a lot of impacts. Mostly, a lot of it was housing related.
Oh, that was great, and thank you, and thanks from Megan Kairos. One more question from Vidal. Did the exclusion, this is going back then, the exclusion of Japanese and Chinese workers have a big impact on the US economy since it was considered cheap labor?
For sure. Yeah, and so you see, like in the, with Chinese exclusion in particular, there was a huge labor shortage, right? Following Chinese exclusion, following the anti-Chinese kind of violence. And it brings up a really interesting tension between like the needs of big business, right? And what the government's doing in terms of immigration restriction. So sometimes we see that the government was working with these big businesses, like, railroads, to kind of facilitate Chinese migration, to facilitate Japanese migration. And at times they're cutting it off. And so that's a really interesting tension too, right? That I kind of trace throughout the book. But yeah, I think when you have these exclusion laws passed, there's always this search for quote unquote cheap labor elsewhere, right? And based on the region that you're in the US, the laborers who are coming in to replace them come from different areas. So we see with Chinese and Japanese workers, they're excluded. Filipinos become a huge source of labor, and Filipinos were very desirable by especially agricultural companies, because they were coming as US nationals, quote unquote nationals. They were colonial subjects of the United States, and so were not subjected to immigration restriction. They could enter the US. So that's why we see so many Filipinos coming after, right, 1924, which was the sort of big immigration act that basically restricted many workers coming in from around the globe. Also, indigenous peoples, right, became a source of labor for agriculture in the Pacific Northwest after Chinese and Japanese exclusion was implemented. So yeah, it's really tied to immigration. A lot of it, immigration, both the patterns of immigration restriction, is why you see these different groups coming into the city at different moments.
Thanks for that. And I have only one more question, because we're right about at time. And this will only take you about 2 hours to answer. But this one is also from the perspective of our MA students, but some of our history students as well. And it's a kind of a mechanics or a logistics question about the field. Your experience with ethnic studies and with the interdisciplinary studies. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts for our history MA students, but also our history undergrad students who are looking at grad school, who are looking longer term at publication in the field of, the interdisciplinary field. Just some brief reflections on that. And again, you could probably speak all day about it, but sort of navigating the disciplines and then the interdisciplinary aspect of ethnic studies. So like I said, my co-organizer Alexander is headed off to the East Asian Languages and Cultural Studies program at Santa Barbara. I came through the Columbia MA interdisciplinary program, then went to a history program. How have you found that? Do you feel that you need to carve out your area more actively? Do you feel that the field of ethnic studies and interdisciplinary studies such as that is growing and welcoming and dynamic, something in between the two? I just would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I was an ethnic studies major, American studies PhD, like inherently interdisciplinary training. And then I now work in a history department. So that's been, that itself has been a bit of a challenge, just navigating the different expectations and what people consider to be history and not. But I think what I think about it is like, in order to tell the history of marginalized people, it has to be interdisciplinary. That's what I think. You have to use whatever tools you can to access and highlight these histories. And that's, you have to include, I include a lot of image, right? Photograph analysis, a lot of images, maps, built environment, a lot of like analysis of oral histories. So you just have to be interdisciplinary. That's kind of what I feel about it, because it just, I mean, as my talk, right, hit on, like, there's limits to what we can do with the traditional archive. There's a lot of limits. And so even using these kind of traditional archival sources, you've got to read them against the grain, right, in a way that will yield some insights. But we're dealing with people who were largely written out of history and largely don't appear in the archive. So you have to be creative and you have to be interdisciplinary with these kinds of histories, right? That's kind of just how I feel. And it's like, you know, you do the work that you do and you, and it comes from there, right? But that's the importance for me of interdisciplinarity, you know, and it's like, I think positioning yourself in whatever fields you are. I mean, I am lucky in that my fields like Asian American history, for example, and also urban history are also very interdisciplinary fields too. And they're very welcoming of interdisciplinary methods, right, and approaches. So I haven't had so much of the kind of problems. And I think my project also lends itself to a kind of history, you know, sort of department or a history oriented sort of focus. But I will say and make a plug for the importance of interdisciplinarity in history. It's actually, to me, necessary. It is necessary in order to tell the kinds of histories that need to be told, because there are limits to going to an archive and just trying to find what's there. You know, you have to be creative. You have to be interdisciplinary in what you're doing. So that's kind of where I've come down on it, that question.
I think that's great, and a great note to end on, because I think that the use of these non-traditional sources, non-traditional, I think now that the field is becoming aware, the field of history, but also interdisciplinary studies of how ethnic studies, how important it is to be omnivorous in these sources. It was such a wonderful talk. Lots of, I think got us all thinking in a lot of new ways. Thank you so much, Professor Megan Asaka, for joining us today. I'll follow up with you by email to wrap a few things up, but I really appreciate it. Thanks everybody for joining. Thank you, Professor Asaka, and I look forward to the book.
Thank you so much. This was a treat. And thank you, Jeremy, for inviting me. It was just so fun to be able to talk with you all.
Thank you.